Well, hello everyone. I'm Jonathan McClatchy. It's been a little while since I uploaded a video interview with someone, but today I'm very pleased to have with me my good friend Wesley Huff, whom I've had on my channel a couple times before, and he is, as many of you know, PhD candidate at University of Toronto in New Testament textual criticism. And recently we actually did an interview together on this channel discussing and reviewing certain arguments that Christians make that are not very good upon further inspection. And we recommended avoiding certain arguments that Christian apologists have sometimes made. Well, we're here today to do a part two of this analysis, and we're going to be unpacking some more arguments that we would recommend that Christians avoid and not use in their apologetic arsenal. We think this is very important to ensure intellectual and academic integrity in apologetics, and to make sure that the arguments that we're bringing forward in defense of the Christian faith are robust and accurate. So, Wesley, thanks so much for coming on to join us today.
Yeah, of course. Just a minor correction. My PhD work isn't actually in textual criticism. It's in scribal habits and the transmission of the early New Testament text. So it's very related to text critical issues. But technically, what my area of expertise in is what's referred to as paratextual features, which is not the text itself, but some of the scribal developments that happen within the manuscripts themselves. So I don't look at the text as much as I do some of the features that develop in and around the development of the text and that thing. But I, have to be well versed within the text critical scholarship in order to even have a background to be able to do that. But otherwise, yeah, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to another one of these bad apologetic arguments that you shouldn't be doing, and discussing those with you, Jonathan.
Well, thanks. That nuance and distinction is helpful. Thanks for the clarification on that. So let's then turn maybe to your field of expertise of New Testament textual criticism, that sort of thing, and review a few arguments that Christians shouldn't be using in their defense of New Testament textual transmission. So where would you like to start with us on this, Wesley?
Yeah, one of the things that I thought we'd talk about today is this idea that's related to sort of the copying process of the Bible. Sometimes you'll hear in presentations that, the Christian scribes were so meticulous in their copying process that, they would do things like if they made a mistake, that throughout the entire manuscript, or they had these checks and balances that they would have in the copying process. I've heard this in many presentations from pastors and individuals who mean well, but unfortunately, there's a lot of confusing and conflating going on. In particular, what's happening is they're applying a standard and method that was common within a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes, which come around at the end of antiquity, the beginning of the Middle Ages, who had this very rigorous process of copying, particularly the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, in which they would have these very, very strict and stringent guidelines to make sure that everything was copied very carefully, that there would be no mistakes. Sometimes they would count the number of words and the number of letters, and they would put sort of a numbering system on the side. Sometimes this is done incredibly intricately. And so we do see those things, but that's a much, much later development. And none of that applies to the early Christian scribes who are producing the New Testament manuscripts. So we need to be very careful. This is a standard and a development that happened within the early Middle Ages with the Masoretes. Now, this did produce a lot of very interesting preservation aspects, especially when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, because when we did discover the Dead Sea Scrolls and we compared some of the Masoretic texts to the Dead Sea copies, we found some incredible correlations between the exact number of words and things like that. The most famous example is the Great Isaiah Scroll, which was word for word with the Masoretic edition of Isaiah. Now, obviously, we have to be careful in that argument, because that wasn't wholesale across every book. There were books like the Dead Sea Scroll Qumran version of Jeremiah, which were different in length. And so we do have to be careful of that. But what that does illustrate to us is that despite hundreds of years of time in between the group in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls and then the Masoretes in the Middle Ages, there wasn't a very careful copying process. The problem is when that's read entirely onto the whole Christian tradition. That was a Jewish tradition. It was a particularly late Jewish tradition. That doesn't invalidate the text of the Old Testament in any way, but we do see in the copying process of the Christian text that we have a mix. We have a mix of copies of New Testament manuscripts, which are professionally copied and done by amateurs. And there are a number of ways we can figure this out. One of which is just simply the stylistic writing. Professional scribes would do particular things that professional scribes would do in order to make a manuscript clean, in order to make sure that it was done properly. We can see amateur scribes trying to copy these things, but not totally knowing what the standards and guidelines for those are. And if you read enough of these ancient texts, which I do to the point where it all sorts of blurs together after a couple of hours of just staring at a Greek text that's all capitals, no spaces in between words, and little to no punctuation. Kind of gives you a headache. But you can pick up on a professional hand versus an amateur hand. And a lot of these were amateur. A lot of them were not done professionally. The early Christians were far less concerned whether you had kind of the proper degrees and scribal criteria than they were with just getting the gospel out. And so for this reason, we have a lot of very sloppy copies. We have a lot of copies where the person makes multiple mistakes, goes back and corrects a lot of those mistakes. And then we have some really, really good manuscripts. But I think to take this standard and say, look at this perfect copying process that we see in the Masoretes, and then broad brush that across the entire tradition of Christian copying. It's incorrect. It's so easily shown to be false. Unfortunately, I found it propagated and repeated in a number of conversations, number of presentations on the reliability of the Bible. And I think we do a disservice to ourselves when we do that. We have enough evidence to show that the textual transmission of particularly the New Testament is very reliable, is very accurate. Arguably, even the mistakes add to its credibility. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when we touch some of the other things related to the reliability of the New Testament and some bad apologetic arguments. But we have so much on our side in that regard. We don't have to be kind of confusing and conflating some later ideas and concepts that the Jews were doing in the Middle Ages and trying to force those on to the early Christians.
Absolutely. Do you think, by the way, that the New Testament scribes, you mentioned that they are unprofessional scribes, untrained. Do you think that they were literate, or are they just copying the shapes of the letters? Because it's commonly said that there was a very high illiteracy rate in the ancient world. Does the fact that these are copied by and large by untrained copyists suggest that maybe a different picture is appropriate, or are these actually illiterate individuals who are just copying the shapes?
That's a really good question. I think we have a little bit of both going on. I actually tend to think that the literacy levels were higher in the ancient world than the vast majority of scholars think. I think there's more or less a consensus that the percentage of people who are literate in, say, the first, second, and third centuries within the Greco-Roman world was approximately at the highest 10%, between 5 and 10%. I think that it actually might have been more, and I think there have been some excavations archaeologically that have shed light on that, particularly when we've discovered graffiti. We've discovered a good amount of graffiti in areas in Roman villages where you wouldn't expect people to be literate, and yet we're finding, kind of the things you would find today. So some very crude statements written on walls, things about people's mothers, things about body parts, which I won't repeat here, and advertisements for gladiatorial games, advertisements for prostitution. These sorts of things indicate that people were, at least at a very low level, reading. Now, whether they were, literate wholesale is a different story. But I think I would give more benefit of the doubt to a lot of individuals, at least being, especially those who are copying these manuscripts, at least having a low level of literacy. There are instances where we can see they're just copying the shapes. And you can figure that out because the scribes make mistakes. You can tell they can't read what they're writing because of the mistakes they make. Sometimes they confuse the columns, which go up and down, and they start copying left to right, which messes up the entire message. Right? It becomes illegible because of that, and they think they're doing what they should be doing, but in the end, they're not. There's some good examples of that. Particularly, I think it's the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, where you have a genealogy, and the person who's copying it in a particular manuscript, I can't remember the name of the manuscript off the top of my head, but he makes some serious mistakes where he basically he sticks God in the middle, and he has Adam somewhere else. Like, the wrong people are begetting the wrong people, and it's clear that he couldn't read what he was writing, and he was just copying incorrectly. So we do have instances of that, although I think it's the idea that the vast majority of these people who are copying were, complete amateurs, that they probably couldn't read. I think that might be overstated to some degree by especially skeptical scholars who want to say, these early copies are done unprofessionally. I think we see a little bit more of a careful hand, and people who, although they might be sloppy at it, seem to have some level of understanding as to what they were doing. And a lot of these copies were clearly commissioned. We see that too. It's not unusual for, say, a Christian to commission a writing of a document from a professional scribe. And also, I'll just add this, Jonathan, while I wrap up, is that we have a good evidence that slaves were used as scribes. And women were used as scribes. So the literacy levels weren't just in the elite and upper echelon of the social strata, although that was most likely the case. But we do have instances where slaves are being made to copy, manuscripts and write things down for individuals.
It's commonly said that the canonical Gospels couldn't have been written by the individuals traditionally ascribed they're traditionally ascribed to, because of the illiteracy rates in the ancient world. And of course, one might respond to that by saying, well, perhaps he used scribes who were literate to copy, to write down what the evangelists wanted them to write. But the evangelists do show themselves to be very well acquainted with the Hebrew Bible, which suggests that whoever wrote the four Gospels were not illiterate. Do you think that undermines the traditional authorship of the Gospels? And what's your thought on that?
No, I don't think it undermines the traditional authorship. I think there would have been an interplay between the different languages that were being used. I personally think that Jesus probably preached in Greek a number of times, if not for his famous Sermon on the Mount. I have a blog post on my website. I think it's even titled, "Did Jesus Speak Greek?" And if you look at the amounts of alliteration and just some of the things that I know you've made those arguments too, Jonathan, for arguing that Jesus spoke Greek. And some of the disciples, they have Greek names. And for the multicultural world that first century Rome was, and particularly in ancient Judea, there would have been numerous languages being spoken, chiefly Greek. Latin was mostly spoken in Rome at this particular time, but we have inscriptions in Latin in and around Israel and Syria. And so I think that it's not completely out of the question that, Mark could write. And I think what we see in sort of the rudimentary writing style in the parataxis and the way that it's written, that I think Mark probably did write it. He wasn't the most articulate writer. He wasn't as good as Luke or Paul. And I think that's what Luke means when he says he's writing an orderly account. I think he's referring to Mark, which is he doesn't think is an orderly account in the way that it's written. That's what I think he's referring to there. And I think it was probably Mark. Whether they did use a scribe, I mean, Paul admits to using an amanuensis, a scribe, in producing his documents. That was also not completely out of the question. It wouldn't have been enormously expensive, although it would have cost quite a bit. But I think it totally makes sense that, and going and giving these authors the benefit of the doubt that they could have produced some of these texts. It wouldn't have been crazy for them to do so, but they also could have utilized scribes, and I don't think that would have invalidated any of the sort of authorship and originality to their document. We also know that in the ancient world, the writing process was more complicated than simply sitting down and opening a Word doc and looking at a couple different books on your desk. When we refer to the original autograph, there probably would have been a couple of those. I mean, we have instances of with Galen and Pliny and a few other ancient writers that they produced an original, an autograph, and for themselves, and then they had one that they would give out. And so in that sense, there are more than one autographs, and those are still the autographs. And there was a grouping of ways that came together within what we would, I guess, refer to as drafts. So that could include scribes, but it also could not include scribes, and that's entirely possible and would have been par for the course in the ancient world for the way that these documents came together.
Sure. Thanks for that insight. So what's the next thing you would like to talk about in terms of bad arguments for Christianity?
Yeah, I think the next one that I want to touch on is the fact that we hear sometimes this argument when defending the New Testament that we have these incredibly old manuscripts, and that because we have such old copies of the New Testament and that they're so close to the originals, that gives it a level of credibility. So older manuscripts are better manuscripts. I think what I want to say in terms of just a cautionary note is that older manuscripts don't necessarily mean better manuscripts. So at face value, there's a concept we can understand within this idea. The idea is that, an earlier manuscript is better because of its earlier date and chronological proximity to the original or initial text. And therefore, a later manuscript is worse because of its late date. That is, that the length of time permits more stages of copying and corruption. And an earlier manuscript is better because it's an earlier date. And I think there's a part of that we can understand, and that is true. The problem is we have lost the majority of anything that's ever been written to time, right? And some later scribes on occasion had in their possession and self-consciously copied much earlier manuscripts that existed then, but don't now. So we do have manuscripts. So one example is there's a manuscript called Minuscule 1730. And Minuscule 1730 is a 10th century manuscript. And it has a high quality text found in manuscripts, but its text actually shows evidence of being 5 centuries older than when it was written. And in turn, that text makes its way downstream into other minuscules. So minuscule just means it's a development of Greek writing that comes around when the oldest ones I mentioned before, reading manuscripts that are all capitals, no spaces in between words, and little to no punctuation. That's what's traditionally referred to as scripta continua, where you had this type of standard Greek writing. Well, over time, the development in things of what we would refer to today as a font develops. So they start spacing out words. They start developing things like capital letters and lowercase letters, and so on and so forth. And that is the difference between what has sometimes been referred to as majuscule, being all capitals, and minuscule, being this more stylized, what we would understand as being easier to read. And so minuscules are much later than majuscules, But what we see in a manuscript like 1730 is that it's a minuscule that actually shows evidence of having the text within being quite early. We also have examples of scribes correcting manuscripts in their possession based on readings they discovered from centuries earlier in the commentaries of individuals like Irenaeus and Clement and Origen and Eusebius. They had in their possession these really early commentaries. They see that they're commenting on certain texts of particularly the Gospels, although not limited to that. And then they're looking at the manuscripts that they have in their day, and they're saying, you know, there's been some additions, some deletions, most likely not intentional, but that happens. And so they're correcting the exemplars they have by these much earlier writings that are in their possession. So even though some of those are, say, 10th century and later, they have in their possession writings from the early church fathers that date back to the 3rd century. And they've used those as correctors to edit the expansion of the text they have. And they document it as such. You know, they note it in some of their, whether they're marginal notes or writings that go along with some of these manuscripts. They say, you know, our exemplar says this, but Irenaeus clearly says this, therefore, we've added the much earlier and more reliable readings. I think we need to understand that scribes were not blindly copying texts. They also had quality controls and would read the writings of earlier scribes along with their exemplar texts to routinely analyze and seek out the most reliable, trustworthy, and correct readings. And one way to get a read on this is to examine some of the most hotly debated later passages, where we might expect blind conformity to kick in for religiously motivated scribes. So we have evidence that later scribes were exercising careful text critical judgment even in those places. So the obvious examples, Jonathan, are the story of the woman caught in adultery, you know, John 6:53 to 8:11, and the longer ending of Mark in Mark's gospel at chapter 16, verses 9 to 20. Now, whether these scribal indications bear on the authenticity of these passages, that's a separate issue to the fact that we have multiple instances of scribes across the centuries noting issues and writing things like scribal annotations or brief comments in the margins concerning their cross-referencing of these passages. And these are the two longest textual variants in the New Testament. And scribes all the way along are noting, you know, there's something else going on here. And so if they were just, you know, blindly copying the text, they would either wholesale leave it out or they would wholesale put it in. But we have a tradition that shows, you know, the scribes are aware something else is going on here. So they're noting it. They're noting it in the manuscripts themselves. And now, with that, what I'm not saying is that a later manuscript is always better or that an earlier manuscript is always worse. I'm also not saying that an earlier manuscript is better or a later manuscript is worse. There are some phenomenally reliable and good texts that are very, very early. And there are also some very sloppy ones, some ones that make a lot of mistakes. And that if you said, hey, Wes, this is the only Bible you can read, I would be in trouble. And the inverse goes for later ones. And actually, another one that just came to my mind while I was talking is there's a manuscript. Actually, let me pull this up. Do you mind if I share my screen?
Of course.
So what I'll do is I will, I'll just share my screen here. And so what you should see is an infographic that I made of P75. And in the infographic, what I show right here is that P75 is a manuscript from the 2nd or 3rd century. But one of the most interesting things about P75 when it was discovered is that it had a very close relation with Codex Vaticanus. So I say in the comment there's a surprising connection between the text of P75 and the 4th century Codex Vaticanus, aka Codex B, sharing 85% agreement with one another, although it is unlikely that the scribes who produced B, Vaticanus, used P75 as an exemplar And if P75 is indeed an earlier text, it was the sort used in formulating the later 4th century codex. So in other words, what we see when we discover something like P75 and we compare it with the text of Codex Vaticanus is that the scribes have in their possession something, not P75 itself, because it actually comes from Egypt, and it's highly improbable that they had that particular manuscript, but they had a manuscript within sort of the same family tree as P75. And P75 is a text from the late 2nd, early 3rd century. Well, Codex Vaticanus is from the 4th century. So whatever is going on, the scribes who are producing sections of Vaticanus had in their possession a textual tradition in the manuscript families that they possessed, something that was in and around the same textual tradition as this collection of much earlier writings. And so as we discover, some of these early manuscripts, sometimes we find out, oh, well, something like the text of Vaticanus, even though it's 4th century, actually comes from the 2nd century. So it's a later manuscript that within its text has a snapshot of a much earlier manuscript tradition. And so in this way, this later manuscript, Vaticanus, can have more reliability than some of the manuscripts that come 100, maybe even 200 years earlier, because we can see a strong, reliable textual transmission from an early reliable text to a later reliable text, and that gives us confidence in some of these later manuscripts. So once again, I think we just need to be careful. We need to make sure that we're not making an argument that because it's, because we have all these early manuscripts, therefore they're more reliable. That can be true, but it can also not be true. And we need to make sure we're not opening ourselves up to undue scrutiny when people bring up early manuscripts that are corrupt, that say things that are clearly false, that include some alteration that we would say, that's not a good example of what the original text looked like. I think we also need to be careful likewise, because it's also important to recognize that what we have from before the 5th century is rather small. Yes, sometimes, we hear presentations on the reliability of the New Testament, and they'll throw out the 6,000 number of 6,000 Greek manuscripts. We talked about this, Jonathan, on our last, arguments to avoid apologetically. Sort of the number of manuscripts and comparing those to other ancient writers. There's a lot of caution in using that. There's a good way to do it, a bad way to do it. And in general, just I see more bad than good in the presentation of that. But just off the top of my head, I mean, before the 5th century, we only really have, I think it's 18 copies of Matthew. We have 3 copies of Mark. We have 8 copies of Luke. And then we have, I think it's 21 or 22 copies of John. And so it's a relatively small group, although those manuscripts are important. And so not to make sure we're not saying something false about the fact that, we have 6,000 manuscripts, but of those 6,000, how many are really these early ones? Because we're using the argument that they're so early, they're so close to the original. But what if they're not? And once again, because although, we talked a bit about it in the last live stream, I continue to see comparisons between the New Testament with other early writers that make it look like the New Testament is closer to the original writings by hundreds of years than other writings. And I think we need to make sure we're not overplaying that hand. I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine, Timothy Mitchell, who, if you don't know, has an excellent blog called the textualmechanic.blogspot.com. In this conversation, he alerted me to a number of manuscripts. There's a manuscript from the Oxyrhynchus collection, P-Oxy 412, which is a copy of Julius Africanus's writings, which is only about 50 years or so after it was originally written. So we have a copy within 50 years. And there's also another Oxyrhynchus manuscript, P-Oxy 405, an early 3rd century copy of Irenaeus's Against Heresies, which dates as early as 20 years within the original writing of Irenaeus's Against Heresies. So These are earlier than a lot of the New Testament copies we have. And so just because the New Testament tends to be earlier than a lot of other writings doesn't mean that it's unanimously earlier. And at the end of the day, what does that prove? I mean, does the New Testament and our earliest extant copies, must they be earlier than everybody else? Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, our belief and confidence in the New Testament doesn't hang on the hinge of them being earlier than Plato or Aristotle or Pliny or Xenophon or Irenaeus. That doesn't necessarily merit that they are more reliable. So we just need to be careful. There are examples of ancient extant copies of writings and works that are within extremely early proximity to the original. And that is true generally for the New Testament, but there are other examples where there are earlier writings that are closer to the originals than we have for the New Testament.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about so sometimes do you think that apologists are prone to emphasizing that most textual variants that we find between manuscripts of the New Testament are insignificant and often downplay the significant variations? Do you think there's a danger there potentially?
Yeah, I think that's another thing that's I think important to highlight is, this was sort of made famous because Bart Ehrman in Misquoting Jesus said that there were between 200,000 and 400,000 textual variants, that, you had approximately 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament. I memorized the Nessie Island 27th edition, 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament. There's now a 28th edition and the number is different. So the one I memorized is arguably out of date. But I think actually that, and so the argument went, there are more variances than there are words. And so, you can't even trust that. And I think both apologists and New Testament scholars kind of pointed out the error in that and saying, well, yeah, there are a lot of variances because there are a lot of manuscripts and that makes sense. But, it's not the number of the manuscripts, it's the nature of the manuscripts, or sorry, the number of the variances, it's the nature of the variances. So there was a lot of truth in that. I think actually that number of 400,000 is now outdated. And because of the discoveries that we have discovered in the last decade or so, since Misquoting Jesus, I think that number is actually probably closer to 500,000 to 600,000 variants. The famous Princeton text critic Eldon Epp, he threw out the number 750,000. He didn't really validate that, but I don't think that's even as crazy as a statement. There could be over 500,000 variances, and the truth in the argument is that the vast majority of these differences within the manuscript tradition are insignificant. I'm talking about, not even making a difference in any way, shape, or form to being even translated out of the original language. So things like word order and spelling differences, you can't translate those out of English. If I spell Jonathan with 2 N's or 1 N or 1 H or 3 H's, when I translate it into English, it's going to be Jonathan. So despite all the spelling differences. And so the vast majority can't be translated out. However, while this is a serious truth, we also need to make sure we don't downplay variants that do hold significance. So for example, Mark 1:1, the phrase Son of God in the statement, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is missing in most of our earliest copies. And the earliest evidence for its inclusion and reception comes from the late 3rd or early 4th century. And so there's a discussion whether that is original or not. The famous words of Jesus from the cross on the way to his death, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, in Luke 23:34. They're missing from a good portion of our best and earliest copies. Now, I actually have a paper that I wrote in grad school on that very topic that you can find on my academia.edu page, where I argue actually for both external and internal reasons that Jesus did say that, despite it not being in some of our earliest manuscripts. We don't just rely on the manuscripts. We look at all of the internal and external factors to be able to figure out whether something is original. And I think that statement actually is original. I think it makes far more sense that it was taken out than it was put in. Nonetheless, this is a textual variant that makes a difference on what Jesus said at the cross. As some of the listeners may know, another one is Revelation 13, the mark of the beast, the number of the mark of the beast. Some manuscripts say 666, but some of our early and prominent manuscripts say 616. And so these are manuscripts, these are copies, these are variances that have some significant issues. That they do have theological implications. Now, do they blow up essential Christian doctrine? No, of course not, because no Christian doctrine is just hung on one single verse. We take Christian doctrine from Scripture as a whole. If the Mark 1:1 Son of God clause is not original to Mark's gospel, does that mean Jesus is not the Son of God? Well, of course not. There are so many other instances of Jesus both being called the Son of God and referring to himself as the Son of God. And so that doesn't blow up our understanding. Does it have an influence and significance on the beginning of Mark chapter 1? Some could argue yes. If Jesus didn't say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, does that mean that the whole concept of the forgiveness of Jesus and the imputation and atonement, those all need to get reevaluated? Well, obviously not. We get those doctrines from Scripture as a whole, tota scriptura, Scripture within its entirety. And so I think it's very, very true that no essential Christian doctrine hangs on any one textual variant. However, when we're presenting this case, if we downplay that there are variants that have theological implications that, we do debate as to whether they're original or not, we're also not doing ourselves a service, because there are significant variances. They don't blow up our entire understanding of Christian doctrine and ethics and practice. But while the vast majority make no difference on the text, some make a difference in our understanding of a particular text. And so that's also something that, you'll hear Bart Ehrman, he might be making a mountain out of a molehill, but there's a kernel of truth when he says that these have theological significance. And we should be aware of that as people who are dealing with and defending the text of Scripture.
Right. And Bart Ehrman, of course, is often very misleading, including in this case. It's not just Christians that are being misleading. There's, of course, a direct correlation between the number of manuscripts we have and the number of variants. And so by extension of Ehrman's argument, the more manuscripts we have, the less reliable will necessarily be the New Testament text. So just throwing out a number of how many variances there are, and there's more variances than there are words in the New Testament, is just a product of how many manuscripts we have. If we had fewer manuscripts, if we only had 3 manuscripts, and by Ehrman's reckoning, we'd have a more reliable, we'd have more trustworthy text. So that doesn't make any sense.
It's very true. If you only have 1 or 2 manuscripts, you have to be sure that those people got it right. And so despite the fact that we have lots of variances within the manuscript tradition, the fact that we have so many manuscripts means that we can do the process of textual criticism in the comparison and analysis to be able to trace the original text back. I think the way that God preserved the text is through the proliferation of getting his word out very quickly in a very short amount of time, and that resulted in a lot of mistakes. And it also resulted in us being able to show a lot of confidence in the veracity of the text.
Of course, there's a parallel between New Testament textual criticism and phylogenetics in evolutionary biology. There's kind of a family tree, just as there is in evolution, there is in New Testament textual criticism. And I think that the fact that you have these multiple independent lines of transmission of the New Testament text is quite a powerful argument for the New Testament textual integrity. Because the conversion of common text, even though they have these multiple independent lines of transmission, we don't have any governing body that's imposing textual uniformity in the text, but we have this free and uncontrolled transmission, and indeed multiple lines of it. Do you think that's a valid argument?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay. So another issue that I wanted to mention is sometimes we find simplistic information that's given in popular apologetic arguments. So, for example, William Lane Craig persistently claims that A.N. Sherwin White, who was a very famous Roman historian, Greco-Roman historian, showed that even 2 generations was too short a time for legendary accretions to arise. And he says this many, many times that one could document in his public debates, his books, and so forth. But when you actually read Sherwin White's book, Sherwin White notes precisely one example, which is Herodotus, and he's not really saying that. He's saying more that legendary embellishment doesn't always arise within 2 generations. He's not saying that it never arises in 2 generations. So I think that we have to be careful in utilizing that source. It's a very common quotation to use, but I don't think that Sherwin White really is saying what he's often represented to be saying. Have you looked into that at all yourself, Wesley?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. Another issue is some epistemological issues in contemporary apologetics. Oftentimes we find a poor nuance in the way that the evidence for and against Christianity is presented. So, for example, it's very common to hear from Christians that there's quote unquote no evidence for evolution, and I would caution against that sort of language, because for any complex topic, whether we're talking about anthropogenic climate change, or we're talking about evolution, or Christianity, the resurrection, the existence of God, vaccine efficacy and risks, there's going to be evidence both for and against the propositions in question. Otherwise, why would scholars take different views on these issues? So I would be very cautious against saying that there's no evidence for this or that when scholars disagree. I think that there's a common misperception in people's minds that evidence is binary, that it either proves a conclusion or it doesn't, right? There's often people forget that evidence can be inconclusive on its own, and you could actually most scientific theories have evidence that confirms the theory, and you also have anomalous scientific data that doesn't quite fit the mold of the paradigm. And so when we have an overwhelmingly well-supported scientific theory, we don't just throw it out when we encounter a small set of anomalous data. Rather, we try to accommodate that anomalous data within the paradigm. And so it's, I think, imprudent to say that there's no evidence for evolution. In the same sense that it's imprudent for an atheist to say that there's no evidence for God or there's no evidence for Christianity, because that's just simply an indefensible statement. Obviously, there's evidence for these propositions. The only question really is there sufficient evidence to justify belief in those propositions? Anything to add to that, Wesley?
No, not specifically, although I think it's a good to point out that broad statements often lead to inaccuracies in the details. And we need to make sure we're not saying things so broadly, this theory has no evidence for it, or that theory has no evidence for it, or even saying something like, say, this thing is not consistent with Scripture. Well, that thing could have a correlation in a consistency with Scripture. That doesn't mean it's true, and that doesn't mean that it's being taught out of Scripture. But I think we often speak too broadly about theories that we ourselves don't believe, and discount that there's a broad range of scholarship, and especially if you're going to go against the majority of scholars. Just because the majority of scholars don't believe something doesn't mean it's true. I, as someone involved in biblical scholarship, believe all sorts of things that are outside of the vast majority of scholars. But I think if we're going outside of the norm, outside of the vast majority, outside of the mainstream, we should have good evidence to the contrary. And to say, well, they just believe that, and there's no evidence for it, or I don't believe that there's good reasons. That's not, those two statements are not the same thing. And so we need to be careful, and we need to be calculated in the way we present particular arguments or information, especially with something like evidence, or sorry, something like evolution. I may not believe evolution, neo-Darwinian evolution, macroevolution, whatever you want to call it, is true. And I don't believe that is the way that, we developed, the way that God created us. However, there is a whole body of scholarship that does. And so I need to make sure that I'm being honest, and I'm representing that body of scholarship as well, and as reflective of what they actually believe is possible. Otherwise, I'm just, once again, I've probably said this a few times already, but opening myself up to undue scrutiny, and potentially invalidating my position in other areas.
Absolutely. Another common mistake that apologists make is to confuse the showing your belief can be made consistent with the data with showing that it isn't disconfirmed by the data. And these aren't the same thing. This is done in particular in young Earth creationist circles, where there's a piece of data. Let's talk about, for instance, distant starlight, light from distant galaxies which are millions of light years, hundreds of millions of light years away from us. And a light year in astronomy, remember, is not so much a measure of time, it's a measure of distance. And to say that something, say a star, for example, is 10 million light years away from us, that means that it takes light 10 million years to get from that star to get to us. And when you read, and of course, this raises a problem for young Earth creationism, which maintains that the entire universe is only 6,000 years old. And you read some of the astronomers who subscribe to young Earth creationism, such as Jason Lyle or Danny Faulkner or Ross Humphreys, and they come up with these really elaborate ways of trying to make the data fit and to shoehorn this data into the mold of young Earth creationism. Now, you can do that if you want. You can make pretty much any data fit any hypothesis if you try hard enough and you're prepared to invoke enough auxiliary hypotheses. However, that doesn't really tell you whether the data tends to confirm your theory or tends to disconfirm it. The way that we should think about evidence, in my view, is along Bayesian lines, which is to say that something is evidence for your hypothesis if and only if that data is better predicted on your hypothesis than it would be on the falsehood of the hypothesis. In other words, if it's more probable that that evidence would exist given your hypothesis than given its falsity. And so it seems to me that it's incontrovertible that the distant starlight that we observe is better predicted on an old Earth view. It's much less surprising in an old Earth view than it is in a young Earth view. And so therefore it tends to confirm the old Earth view relative to the young Earth view. And I think that that's something that's often missed in many circles. And that it's important to bear in mind that although you can make any data consistent with your theory, the question that you really want to ask is, does this data tend to confirm or disconfirm the theory? And of course, I think that data is often complex and messy, and I think that there's evidence both for and against the existence of God, as well as both for and against the truth of Christianity. I happen to think that the evidence for Christianity is better than the evidence against it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't acknowledge the existence of evidence that tends to contradict our views. Such as, I think the problem of evil, for example, is something which tends to disconfirm theism. It's just not the only evidence on the table. If it was the only evidence on the table, I'd be an atheist. But since there's other evidence which counterbalances it, I think overwhelmingly, I think that Christianity has sufficient grounds to at least provide indirect reason to think that there is some morally sufficient reason for God's permission of evil in the world, even if it currently eludes us. Anything to add to that, Wesley?
No, I think that's very well put. I also think that we often throw out the term evidence or the term data or the term facts, and we don't ourselves clearly articulate what we mean by that. And so I think having a theory as to how we derive and define what evidence is goes a long way in helping us make our own case. Well, there's lots of evidence this way, or there's lots of evidence that way. Well, what do we mean when we use the word evidence? And I think that the Bayesian hypothesis is a very good one to hang our hat on in that particular regard. So make sure we're being careful in the ways we use words like data or facts or evidence, and make sure that we're being consistent with that.
Yeah, and another example of a bad argument that I would discourage people from using is the common attempt to dismiss arguments from evil, so the argument from evil, from natural evil and personal evil, as well as moral critiques of the Bible, such as the Canaanite conquest and things along those lines, with the statement that atheists cannot ground the concept of objective morality. This is a very common rejoinder to when an atheist brings up the problem of evil or brings up moral critiques of the Bible, to say, well, that argument has to steal from God in order to build its case. Because evil, the very concept of evil, so the argument goes, presupposes the existence of God. It presupposes some sort of transcendent moral lawgiver, and therefore you have to borrow from a theistic worldview in order to argue against a theistic worldview. Although the argument is very popular, I think it's unsound for the following reason: that even supposing, for the sake of argument, that the moral argument works and that it points to the theistic position, and the theistic position is the best basis for objectively grounding moral norms and duties in the world. Even supposing that is the case, the atheist can still turn around and say, well, I might not be able to ground objective moral norms and duties in the world, but you claim that you can. And this argument is being run as an internal critique. There's an internal inconsistency in your own view. And so the argument, I think, can still be run by the atheist, even supposing that the moral argument works. And any comment on that, Wesley?
I guess in regards to that, I would ask Jonathan, in terms of the way that you think about that. Do you think that there is a way that the atheist can come up with a theory to find a solution to making objective moral statements?
Sorry. The way that I frame the moral argument is that it's very difficult to ground, if not impossible to ground. In fact, I think it is impossible to ground objective morality on the hypothesis of naturalism or physicalism. I think that you can, in principle, sustain objective moral norms on atheism if you're prepared to give up naturalism. So you could, for instance, be a Neoplatonist and think that there's some sort of ethereal realm where there are these moral abstract objects, if you will, and that therefore morality is objective, even in the absence of a God. Now, that's possible, and there are atheists who are not naturalists. Thomas Nagel would be one example of a philosopher who's an atheist but not a naturalist. So that's certainly possible. So the way that I would frame the moral argument would be to level it more as an argument against naturalism, so it's more modest in its what it proposes. And since naturalism is the most consistent way to be an atheist, it in turn raises the probability of theism, because it takes away one of the most consistent ways of being an atheist. And therefore, if you're going to retain your atheism, it's going to have to be a very funky type of atheism. And so it indirectly then supports theism. I don't think it's conclusive in support of theism, but I think it tends to confirm theism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so there would be an arena where posing that objection to an individual would make sense. Would you say that if they outed themselves as a natural materialist, then and started to make sort of decry, say, problems of evil?
Oh, your audio just went off. Okay, you're back. Yeah, so I would say that let's just grant let's suppose I'm an atheist. What I would say, if you raise that objection, is that let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that you're correct, that I cannot, as an atheist or as a naturalist, ground objectively the idea of moral norms and duties. But you claim you can. You claim that you are able to do so. And yet there's this internal inconsistency because the God that you claim grounds objective norms violates those objective norms. And so there's an internal inconsistency in your perspective.
But what if I believe that those things are not something that God lives up to, but something that are innate to his character? So good is good because not because God lives up to what is good, but because we believe that something is good because it is consistent with God's actual character.
But God's character is indistinguishable from God's actions. So if God's if the atheist makes, for example, a moral critique of the Old Testament, if that moral critique is sustainable, then it holds irrespective of whether the atheist is able to ground objective moral norms and duties. It holds, it is, the atheist can reasonably raise an internal critique where they say that God is inconsistent with his own character as portrayed by the Bible and as portrayed by Christian theologians who claim to be able to ground objective norms and duties in the world in God's character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's something that I have to think about a little bit more. Given with what you said, I tend to think that people try to defend God against evil more than Scripture does. I think that we look at some of the places like Isaiah 45, 5-7, which clearly states that God forms light and creates darkness, makes well-being and creates calamity. And he says, I'm the Lord who does all these things. Or Deuteronomy 32, 39, see now that I myself am he, there is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I've wounded and I will heal, and no other can deliver out of my hand. Like, I think there are lots of examples of places where God is clearly orchestrating what we would consider to be calamity. And we try to defend God against his sovereign hand in some of the things that we're not comfortable with. So I think that there's an aspect of that God is God and we are not.
So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there aren't responses that one can make to the problem of evil and moral critiques of the Bible and so forth. I'm just saying I just don't think that's a good response. I don't think it's a good response to say that the atheist can't objectively ground moral norms and duties, because he can respond by saying, well, I don't need to in order to run this argument. All I need to know is that you have this system of ethical norms and duties which your own God doesn't live up to. So that particular move, I think, is I think it doesn't work. I think it's not very convincing. Of course, I think that there are other moves that one can make. That's why I'm still a Christian, but I just don't think that's a particularly good objection to that argument. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So another one we'll talk about is J. Warner Wallace's recent publication, Person of Interest. Now, I actually wrote an essay on this on my website, which you can find at johnmcclatchy.com/writing. I wrote a critique of J. Warner Wallace's recent book, Person of Interest. Now, I am someone that actually likes J. Warner Wallace's previous work. I think that God's Crime Scene and Cold Case Christianity, though I would perhaps nuance some of the arguments a little bit differently. I think that it's a really good popular level introduction to some of the arguments for the existence of God and the credibility of the New Testament text. The more recent book, Person of Interest, I find some of the arguments in there to be quite problematic. One of the emphases in the book, and if you want the detailed discussion of it, I invite viewers to check out my essay on my website on it, is that he spends a lot of time showing the huge, massive influence that Jesus has had on Western culture and art, music, and literature, and so forth, which is all fair and well. It's very, very true. Jesus has had a massive influence. And it's even okay, I think, to describe that as contributing some evidence for Christianity. I think that is certainly something that might be considered to be more probable given Christianity, given its falsehood. I don't think it's conclusive on its own. But I think that Jim Wallace in the book tends to radically overstate his case in that you can basically prove Jesus from sources outside the Bible, without even using the New Testament text, and that you can reconstruct the entire story of Jesus from Jesus' contribution to art and literature and so forth. And I don't think that it really contributes much to our case to argue that, because these are not epistemically independent instances, right? And since these are not epistemically independent, then there's a problem that rears its head, known as the problem of diminishing returns by multiplying examples, which is to say that you cannot simply multiply examples indefinitely of Jesus' influence on literature and music and art and so forth, and expect the case to continue to increase in strength, because these are not epistemically independent. These are linked together. They're causally related. And so that, I think, is a really significant weakness in Wallace's book. So he says, for example, in the book, it is indeed a worst case scenario approach. He says, I'm trying to find a quote. Yeah, so he says, we don't have, so he says in the book that we don't have Jesus' body, and we don't have a crime scene to provide us with physical evidence. We can still make a case for the historicity and deity of Jesus. We can do it without a body and without any evidence from the New Testament. You read that correctly. Now, statements like that in the book appear to be quite emphatic, that you could actually demonstrate the truth of Christianity without any appeal to the New Testament. Wallace's assertions that the impact of the world upon the world of one individual is only a much broader case. This is something that he's claimed to me in Facebook threads and so forth. But that's at odds with statements that we do not, as he says in the book, quote, need the evidence provided by the Gospels to know the truth about Jesus. So that appears to me to be a much stronger epistemological claim than what Wallace appears to make when he's actually challenged on this. And so I have some serious reservations about the book. There's also a section in the book where he talks about extra biblical attestation to Jesus, and this is within your wheelhouse, Wesley, also, where he discusses the apocryphal Gnostic Gospels, which arose in the centuries following Jesus' death. And he notes that, quote, so he says, years after the completion of the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, dozens of non-canonical Gospels and writings emerged across the empire. The authors of these texts hoped that they would be taken seriously. In fact, religious groups of one kind or another used most of these non-canonical writings alongside the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. The authors liked Jesus and recognized his influence and power, but their desire to go up the power and authority of Jesus led them to contradict, falsely supplement, or alter the canonical narrative. Groups that embraced the teachings of these texts, many of whom were Gnostic, strayed so far from orthodoxy that they were not recognized or identified as Christians by the earliest Christian leaders. While the non-canonical authors certainly liked Jesus, these non-Christians sought to co-opt his story for their own purposes, end quote. So he contends that, quote, despite the legendary distortions, these non-canonical documents presuppose and acknowledge the claims of the canonical Gospels, just as the legendary distortions of Elvis assumed and affirmed the core truths related to Elvis's life, accomplishments, and death, end quote. So, and then as an example, he notes concerning the Gnostic Gospel of Peter that he says, so quoting, despite many distortions, the Gospel of Peter affirms many details of the Passion Week described in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. It also lists the names of the disciples and affirms critical features of the canonical Gospels, such as the resurrection of Jesus. His wording there, I think, gives the reader the strong impression that he's intending to use the Gnostic Gospels as independent testimony to Jesus' ministry and Jesus' resurrection. But that doesn't work, because the Gnostic Gospels were, of course, written extremely late. The Gospel of Peter was written in the mid-2nd century, and they have no claim to historical credibility whatsoever. In fact, any information that's of historical value that may be gleaned from the Gnostic Gospels is derivative from the canonical Gospels. So there's no reason to believe them to have independent access to the events of Jesus' life. Anything to add to that, Wesley?
Yeah, I think the trained historian in me, for lack of a better way of putting it, is kind of confused by some of the things that are said in there. Well, once again, I would affirm with you, Jonathan, that I appreciate a lot of Jim's work. I've met Jim in person, and he's a very kind, very intelligent guy. And on the whole, I think some of his previous works I really appreciated, and especially the angles that he came from as a cold case detective. I think there's something very unique to applying his methodologies that he does there. However, in this one, I think it's at best, I think the thesis of the book is unnecessary, and I mean that in the most genuine way possible. The fact is that you don't throw out the earliest source material to prove a point. We have the New Testament, and I don't actually think that if you do throw out the New Testament, you can get as much as Jim claims you can from some of these other sources. Like you said, that the Gnostic Gospels, anything that we can derive from the Gnostic Gospels that is true of the historical Jesus is borrowed from the canonical Gospels. I mean, the Gospel of Thomas contains quotes or paraphrases from 16 of the 27 New Testament books. It's completely reliant on the New Testament books for its actual historical information as to who Jesus was. And at best, what we get from these sort of extra biblical sources, particularly the Docetic and Gnostic and Ebionite writings, is a silhouette. It's a shape or a shell of a character that could look like Jesus. But if we were to actually evaluate what fills out that silhouette based on these sources, we wouldn't get the historical Jesus. We get something very different. We get a character that is one of the aeons of the Gnostic pleroma. We wouldn't get the incarnate Son of God who stepped out of eternity as the second person of the Trinity into humanity to live a perfect life, die on a cross, physically rise from the dead. We wouldn't get those details. We wouldn't get the gospel. We would get something very, very different. And so I think at best, the thesis is a little bit unnecessary and maybe a little bit confusing, considering how much we do have that pertains to the reliability of the historical Jesus. And at worst, I think it actually overplays its hand to claim that we can do something that we can't. And I mean, Jonathan, you and I talked about, and going back and forth a little bit about Jim's book after it was first published, that the thesis could actually apply to the ancient Greco-Roman gods. There's a lot of trickle down within our modern society that could give us a lot of pictures of Zeus and the ancient Amazons and
Or
some
weekdays,
of these.
of course. Our weekdays are
What's
named
that? Sorry.
after. Our weekdays are named after ancient gods.
Yeah,
Our
all
months.
sorts of things. And even the solar system is said to be heliocentric, right? With the sun at the center around which the planets revolve. We could say, well, that gets us a picture of the fact that the constellations, the zodiac signs, these are all things that could give us a picture of Zeus and Athena and Venus and Jupiter, Mars, all of these type of things. And then that's not even to mention the impact that it has on modern society and sort of pulp culture. We have Cupid, who pops up in modern pop culture, lots of TV references. Almost all of our superhero movies have some sort of allusion to a Greek or a Norse god. There are all sorts of references in like Harry Potter, anything that has some sort of magic component to it has some sort of nod at the ancient Greco-Roman mythologies or the Norse mythologies. And even, the Nike, the goddess of victory, is the inspiration for the sports brand Nike. And their logo, signifying the swoosh, is a representation of bravery and strength of the Greek warriors. These are things, there are lots of things within our society that if we want to use kind of the same methodology, would give a lot of credibility to the ancient Greco-Roman pantheon. Now, we don't need to do that. That's not necessary. There's no reason to say, well, all of these things in a cumulative case point to some validity of a historical Greco-Roman pantheon. We don't need to do that. It's not necessary. Yes, there's an extremely strong influence on our culture. The ripple effect of Jesus has clearly influenced particularly modern Western society. Does that mean that therefore we can recreate the entire story of who Jesus was in the New Testament? I don't think so. And I don't think that that argument is necessary, given that we have 27 ancient books that refer to the life of Jesus and refer to the gospel message that are incredibly reliable, and that some of which are independent written sources that didn't know of the other written sources that we now included in our New Testament. All of the Gnostic Gospels, all of the Docetic Gospels were reliant on these sources for anything that they derive as an accurate and true picture of the historical Jesus.
Absolutely. So let's finish maybe with one final point, that another argument which is very popular among Christians that I personally I'm not particularly persuaded by, which is often planting this evolutionary argument against naturalism. And basically, for those of you that don't know the argument is essentially that that if you affirm evolution and you think that your mind is a result of unguided natural processes of chance and necessity, then there's no reason to think that your mind has evolved to accurately represent the world, and that your sensory perceptions actually approximate to the external reality. And therefore, when you reason about naturalism, you've actually undercut the basis for inferring naturalism as true, because you have no reason to think that your mind has evolved for determining truth about the world. And my concern about this argument is that it presupposes what's known as externalism, which is a branch of thinking in epistemology, in contradistinction to internalism, which is kind of the view that I would subscribe to, which externalists like Plantinga, they prefer to talk about warrant rather than justifications for beliefs. So they would say, for instance, that our belief in the approximate reliability or sensory perceptions of the world is a warranted belief, and they would use language like it is properly basic belief. And if you subscribe to a more internalist view, which is kind of the view that I would subscribe to, then you don't simply need to assume that sensory perceptions give us an approximate description of the world, but I would actually argue you can justify the reliability of sensory perception and or cognitive functions and so forth. And I think that you can make an inference to the best explanation. I think that the hypothesis that our sensory perceptions are giving us an approximately accurate picture of the world is the most parsimonious explanation of our experience. It's the least complex explanation, and therefore it's a rationally justified explanation. And therefore, even supposing that that it's enormously improbable that evolution would generate minds that actually accurately analyze the world and yield truth. The fact that you can justify the accuracy of our cognitive functions and sensory perceptions and so forth provides a basis for thinking that nonetheless evolution did justify, did bring about the reliability of sensory perceptions and our cognitive functions and so forth. And so if you have reason to think that evolution is true, and if you also have reason to subscribe to naturalism, I don't think that the evolutionary argument against naturalism is particularly compelling if you are prepared to admit that the reliability of our cognitive functions and sensory perceptions of the world can be justified in that way. Anything to add to that, Wesley, or perhaps you disagree? I don't know.
No, I think you put that well. I don't necessarily have anything to object to or
Okay.
take away or add
Would,
to.
would you agree with my assessment of that one, or?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to. It's not necessarily something I've thought about it at length before, but at face value, I don't think I have any strong objections.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks so much, Wesley, for coming on. It's been a joy having you again, and we should do this again sometime.
You betcha. It's always a pleasure. You're a great mind, and I'm always encouraged by your contribution to the world of the defense of the Christian worldview, Jonathan. Appreciate
Oh,
you.
thank you so much, and likewise, I always appreciate your contributions as well. So that's why we have you on my team at talkaboutdoubts.com, where we're taking one-on-one Zoom calls from Christians that wrestle with intellectual doubts. So if that describes any of you in the viewing audience that are struggling with doubts about the veracity of Christianity, then please check out our website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and consider submitting a question there, and we will do our best to schedule a one-on-one live Zoom call with you to discuss your questions and doubts in confidence. So hope to see you over there. But for now, we will sign off here, and we'll see you in the next one. All right.